So in short, Dice now has localized rotation support. So what this means is that if you press Q, go under Mesh Tools, and you activate Dice, you'll be able to have it orient to your object. So if we were to take this object and rotate it, and we go back into Dice, we see that now it actually orients it to the local orientation. And the same thing goes for if you control click Dice for Boxelization. That part is also now supportive of local rotation on the object. In addition to that, there's also an unlock for Boxelization, meaning that if I were to press Tab, I could actually uncheck Boxelization and actually toggle each individual axis to get a specific count related to Boxelization. So if you want to boxelize on only the X and the Y, you can do that. For example, here I am setting it up. I'll press Tab, toggle off Boxelization, but let's say I only want the Y and the Z and not the X. I still have the same parameters from whenever I scrolled and set it up. However, I'm not constrained to having to use all three axes at once. So with all that out the way, let's press Alt S, Alt G, Alt R, and place it back in the center, and we'll just create a quick shape involving Boxelization. So getting started with Boxcutter, we'll just cut out a great deal of the shape, look at it from top view, press Q, use Everscroll to recall this boolean, and we'll perform some subsequent cuts on it as well, and subsequent cuts on that as well, just getting us a little starter shape. From the side we can cut a few more angles in here, just letting Ngon do its thing. We can press Alt V and E in order to get the viewport just looking a little bit better. We could also press D, change over to box, and perform a cut. We can also perform a cut here, but we'll press W on the way down and use Control in order to get a perfect wedge. We can press Alt X in order to mirror, and we will just press X to reset the mirror to the default and just simply add a mirror mod. We could have done it with new mirror as well, it didn't matter. But from this point we can now just go under Mesh Tools, and if we Alt click Dice, we can actually Smart Apply on the way in. But you could always just press S whenever you're in Dice if you're needing to Dice and Smart Apply on the way. Another thing is that, the twist functionality of Dice came over, meaning that you could press T, and it'll exit you to twist whenever you click to apply your dice. So here's the result of us dicing and twisting this. So obviously this isn't correct, so we want to press F in order to flip, which also made over all the classics of the previous Dice we intended to keep in this new version of Dice that is still on the expansion route. So even though this is flip, we want to select these end faces and just delete them, giving us something like this. And from here, I like to press QOT and use Q operations and 2 shape. And from here, press spacebar, change it over to a cylinder. We can just click and select these 2 faces after applying and just delete them. After selecting everything, we can just press E, right click, Alt S, and just push this out. Kind of the laziest way to do things. And GG, slide this in. And QS sharpen, and things are looking good so far. However, looking at the shape as a whole, faceting isn't going to work for this, considering that we diced this to a very smooth amount. So this is where I would actually go under Add Modifiers, and if we Alt click on Subdivision, that means we'll send the subdivision to the top of the stack, basically allowing us to up-res the lower res version of the model without getting to the modification of it. So let's just press Control A and Visual Geometry to Mesh, and if we look at our geometry, we see have a bunch of extra loops that are not needed. So we could just press Q, go under Add Modifiers, Decimate, and things will get cleaned up pretty nice just with the Decimate modifier. However, we could also do it destructively by just cleaning the mesh, which is also very nice. So clean mesh was actually a little too harsh. In this case, it might be better for us to just manually dissolve these edges, just so we still have edge selection at this point. And with this edge selection, we could just Control click Mark in order to just bevel this edge. We could press 1 in order to force our profile to be 1.5. And from here, we're now looking at our near finished object. So even going back into bevel, I like going into bevel from object mode, because whenever I press Shift P and I begin scrolling through the profiles, it just looks a lot better. So Usually I'll find a nice profile that just gives not a lot of detail. We now have default bevel profiles added to HardOps, so it should be easier for users to get started with them. We'll press QOT again in order to bring in another cylinder, and we'll control roll the wheel in order to just place this shape below. And we can press S and Z in order to scale this in. By sharpening it, we're able to auto mark the edges that we want creased, meaning that we could just press Control 1 and bevel this as well. And we could even select this shape and just Control click bevel to add a bevel modifier, roll it down to low segments, and we just have a little bit of delineation between those two surfaces. So the next thing from here is putting some sort of light rings on the inside. So we will just look at our object. Obviously this object is still modified heavily, so let's just press Q and shift click Smart Apply in order to get a Smart Apply duplicate. Now if we look at this from top view, we want this loop and we want this loop, and so I'll just press Control I, flip that, and we're just going to select the vertices directly in the center. Press Control plus, you know, just a couple of times. Control I, invert it, get rid of them. And we could just drag this up and just select the endpoints and extrude them down. And in order to give us more flexibility with our bevel, we will just dissolve a few points and press Control Shift B in order to bevel individually, but we want to apply our scale first, just so whenever we perform this bevel, it's actually nice and smooth. With this shape, we can Control click Smart Apply, which will convert it to a curve, giving us this. And looking at it from top view, we can from here just choose to convert this to a mesh, giving us more options in the Q menu where we can go to radial array and just Control click it in order to perform a radial array around the 3D cursor, giving us this as our result. So finally we can press QOT, bring up another cylinder, but we got a Control scroll to reset it back to its initial position, and this will do. And we'll just raise it up slightly, sharpen it, put a level of subdivision on it, add a bevel to the edge, and then under the Alt M menu we want to shift click blank material, which will set this to be a glass material, and we'll just hide that. We'll select this piece and we'll just Alt click to give it a emission material. With everything else selected, we could just Control click blank material to give everything a unique material. And if we press Alt H, press 1, we are now looking at our near final result. However, if we jump over to our render, we could see kind of what our render materials gave us. So for this object, we could just shift click on material scroll in order to scroll through other iterations of a different material that could have been. And so with something like this, we could then go back in, play with our map scroll, press E a couple of times to just bring up random maps until we find one that really suits this particular surface. And we may even want to hold Control and move our mouse in order to adjust our scale in the 3D view. Hold Control Shift, maybe affect the normal just slightly. We can still press N or E actually to jump to random images until we find just a perfect image. So maybe something a little more subtle. And as far as bloom goes, my favorite way to activate bloom in the 3D view is just to press Alt VV to go into my viewport adjustment. And after finding the right HDR to have as my background, I can press Q and activate bloom as well. And if we press Shift Space, we can just let this play back. Alright, however, we want to continue on because we're not done yet. So this shape is relatively simple. However, we do want to give ourselves a little bit of trouble to solve. So first things first is I'm going to slice off the top, and we're also going to slice off the bottom. And from here we'll just switch over to Ngon and perform a cut like so, but that cut isn't trouble enough. We want to make it even more difficult, so we want to press B and then roll the wheel a little bit. We see that we have about 4 segments. That'll do as far as solving goes. I'm always thinking about solving whenever it comes to looking at the geometry. So for this to really pop into render, it's going to need a bevel, but if we press Alt V, we can see that we have some flows that are running counter to each other. So getting them to really transition into each other is going to be a bit of an art, unless we were to either transfer normals or really work the topology. And in this case, I'll opt for working the topology. Let's just go under operations and we'll hit it with a smart apply. And I'm just going to control click loops all the way around until I'm back. And the first thing we want to do is quarantine this area and protect it. So I'm going to shift click mark, which will put me in the select tool. And if we press B, we could actually bevel this edge. And we want to do the same thing with this area. However, we want to look at the geometry and make sure there's not any like super near misses, and there are. So it's, do we want to sacrifice topological integrity in order to get rid of these near misses? I guess so. So sometimes in these cases I experiment with different strategies for dealing with geometry, but in this case we'll settle for these near misses. But for this one, we'll hand this one off to a different vertice just to ensure that nothing happens with the topology. We'll select this edge and control click to this edge. And I just got to remind users that, you know, whenever I'm in the heat of working, this process happens in like 30 seconds. So, you know, it may seem slow in videos, but it really isn't in my actual life. I get in and just handle these things. So I could have auto verti mergy. God, I'm having a stroke today, you guys. But if I have auto vert merging on, then we don't have to actually go through and manually merge these things. But we do see that there are some skews indicating that there could have been some handoffs chosen in advance that probably would have better held this surface. However, every time I solve this geometry, I feel like I learned something new about just how fickle geometry is as far as it being held together and how little is actually required to convey a surface. But you know, that's a talk for another video. So you might have also noticed that I did this partially. That's because I could press Alt X, scroll to something like symmetry, shift click on X to keep mirror, and then click on Y to do Y and be done with Y. So if we press Alt V and we get out of our wireframe, we see that it looks like we did nothing at all. However, now we can control click bevel and we can just really add a bevel there and the surface will hold together. So, you know, you're probably thinking, wow, that's cool, but you know, could you do it twice? Sure, I gotta. Let's get in here, Q, smart apply, and let's evaluate our crash scene. So first thing is we want to keep all this. There's a decimate modifier involved in the construction of this, so that's why everything's cleaned up like this. And we'll just shift click mark. We're already in select tool. If you're in merge under M, you can just press S and jump back over to select, and we'll just press B. You know, lately we've been focusing a lot on merge, but select is still great. You know, these tools are so theoretical right now, but one day they will approach their final versions. Like even now we're discussing the next level of the topo tool of kind of what select tool is to become. But a degree of planning is preferred. It saves pain on the coding room floor. So let's just select this edge, control select this other edge, and we have our area set up. We'll shift click mark and we'll press B in order to protect our parameter. And we see that the further we go, the more skewed our parameter gets, and that there are some realignments. I'm telling you, every time I look at this, I just see automatic solutions that are handling these things where, you know, a system would exist that would basically read these edges skewing and automatically jump them over to the next nearest junction. Because in the end, all we care about is this parameter. We could delete all of this geometry and reconstruct everything in between with really efficient quad geometry if needed. But for the most part, if you can protect a perimeter, then you can easily add a bevel to these things, even though they're like curvy shapes on curvy shapes, and get a nice result. I mean, I don't even know if I put a weighted normal on this shape. That's how easy the process was. So let's just jump over to our render now. And with this very large bevel happening and this distinct shape change, we now have a much nicer result. So while this isn't a Q box, we'll save this as a cylinoid. Maybe not a let's go with a cylindrical, because a cylinoid is indicative of a particular caliber of workflow. So we're not even getting all mod crazy today. Really, we're just in here talking about dice, but I wanted to end the result talking about some of the other tools connected to the workflow, and also, you know, dice in a more practical setting and getting a more finalized result. But with that, we can begin moving on to the next part. So previously we were talking about how dice has the ability to support localized rotation. For example, if the object has unapplied rotation, we can still orient the dice object to that object. However, in the event that you need to override it using another method, you're also able to, say, add an empty, and by having rotation on the empty and having it in your selection, you can actually override the dice using an empty that's in your selection. So this can be assistive for times where you're cutting out in space and the object's not oriented to anything globally. You'll still be able to have a level of control and dice an object on the fly just by having it selected and just clicking dice, and you could still go in and actually dice at any angle that's needed when the case arises. Now that we discussed empty overriding for rotation whenever it comes to dice, let's use the example that I've been preparing, and that is we'll take this cube, scale it out a bit, and we'll Control R, add a loop in the middle, just raise this middle edge up, and we'll just alt click this loop, press Control B in order to bevel, and from here we can press D, and our circle is at 32 as specified in our D helper. However, in order to put a loop exactly where I want, I'm just going to place a loop cut here so I have an adjacent dot. And we'll just bring our circle in and press Shift T in order to just bring that in. And we'll just click and apply and Control A to apply visual geometry to mesh. And at this point, we can just merge some of these near doubles. We could shift click mark, press M to jump over to merge tool, and actually just drag any points that look like they possibly have a straggler nearby. Press C to cancel if you end up accidentally selecting the wrong point, and I believe that actually does it. So by keeping the geometry pretty sparse, it's easily controllable. But the main thing we want to do here is take the object in edit mode and rotate it, so that way if we press Alt G, Alt R, Alt S to rotate things, we don't actually have that level of control back. So the first thing we'll do is sharpen it, because our Control tilde settings are set to mark seams. So that means that all of our boundaries are marked. And if we go in face mode, we can press L and we can select things that are isolated by boundary selections if we use UV seams. So selecting this face, we could press Control plus to just grow this out. And I have the hotkey of Shift tilde, which under the select menu is mapped to select boundary loop, where I just select a series of things and then it'll just select a boundary loop. But from here, we'll just shift click mark, press B, and just bevel that out slightly. And over the last few examples, I got a little bit more experimental with the surface, but this time I actually want to hold the surface in place like you're seeing me doing now, where I didn't replace the original topology just yet. But now I'm going to press X and just do a limited dissolve to just get rid of what can possibly not have to be here anymore. And so now that we have this rotated out in space and our geometry looks as terrible as possible, in fact, we'll jump over to EVHQ so the shadows also show us how terrible the surface looks. We can now press Q, go under mesh tools, and we just use dice. So we see that just normal dice isn't going to cut it for us. And this is one of those cases where an empty override would actually be needed for the surface. So using set origin, we now have the ability to press A to change the cursor mode, which has always been a thing. I just haven't talked about it yet. A again will change you over to empty mode, where basically we can drag from dot to dot, and we've basically created an empty that's actually oriented to this particular area that we've drawn the empty on. So from here we can actually select both objects, just tab this object in the local mode with the empty still selected. If we were to press Q and we go into dice, we see that our dice is a little bit stranger, but it actually is fitting this particular surface area that we're aiming to encompass. In fact, we may even want to try it from object mode just to make sure that we're actually encompassing this object. And we see that while it's being overshot a significant deal, it's also being reoriented to fit this particular object, but also taking the rotation of the empty into account. So I imagine in the future it'll get even more accurate, but from here we just want to roll the wheel. We could go into Boxelization, where basically we can ensure that every shape is going to be cut in the shape of a box. We could press tab in order to pause this operation, and by unchecking Boxelization we can then check the axis we want, thus keeping the count that we acquired from the Boxelization use. And so if we click, what you should expect is to go into edit mode, and the operation existed only on the geometry that we left visible. So previously I demonstrated how Boxcutter is also assisting in this regard, because there's some things that we just haven't put into the new dice yet, but Boxcutter is just primed for it, even though Boxcutter probably doesn't need topological correction written into its lore. Let's just ensure that we don't have any garbage selection in here. That edge doesn't need to be deselected. And when it comes to this process, it's real delicate, because if you end up deleting the wrong thing, you'll end up compromising the integrity of your circle. In fact, we want to dissolve that one just because it's just too close. Keep everything fairly quadrish. However, you know, some of these near edge loops I feel just don't even need to exist. So now we have something that looks a little bit better, but it could look even better. So let's press Alt H and bring back our original geometry that we had. I'm just going to select this loop, Control plus a couple of times, Shift tilde to grab the boundary loop, and we could just press Q. Or actually in this case, I actually enjoy using Mesh Machine's Boolean cleanup in this operation, where I will just go into it, roll the wheel once, and then move the cursor in order to just quickly dissolve the every other. It's kind of what I've been referring to them as. And then we can just slide some of these areas out. In fact, this area, we want to have a little bit of relaxation and the tension happening, because it's just dissolving a little fast. So maybe something like that. And then we can just pull it back. The goal isn't to completely quadrify it, but really just to get some better topology flowing around here. So we see that our markings right now are based off of kind of protective boundaries, not really accurate. So instead of running sharpen, I'm going to hold Control Shift, which will actually use resharp, and that will clear out all the previous markings and then remark the edge as it's supposed to be. So we could even get in and get rid of this one. If we wanted to get really specific, we could extrude this area in, remove its marking, and then press Control F and go for grid fill. And we can just grid fill this area to something that's to our liking. And just like that, we were able to basically resurface this area. So if we were to press Q and we can go to bevel, we see that because we were able to protect the boundary of our geometry just right, we were able to promote this to bevel, and there was really no issue to it. In fact, we even take a step further. Let's press Control 1 and add a subdivision on top of it. And if we press Alt V and we look at the wireframe, we see that while subdivision is having a little bit of a time, it's able to at least accept this surface with the every other method that's being demonstrated here. Not saying that this is an acceptable topological method, but just to give a little bit of context to why dice has the ability to have its orientation overridden with empties, and why Boxelization is important, and why local rotation support is also important, is because, you know, eventually I aim for dice to not only be able to rotate to an area, but also to be able to conform along curves and other forms like that, and to be able to flow along particular shapes to give us exactly the topology that we want in a particular area. But with that, I believe you guys get the idea. Just like that, we're able to just get in, dice this area, replace this topology, correct it with minimal effort, using a little bit of Mesh Machine at the end, but hopefully you guys get the idea. So with our trusty cube, we'll press Q and add a bevel, roll a few segments, and then we'll draw a cut, but we'll press X and make it into a slice. And we will just perform a few cuts, maybe lower the bevel on this second object, perform another cut, select our primary object, perform a few cuts, maybe even select it and perform a slice on it, moving it so we don't get cornered by the bevel. And with this shape, we'll just select everything and we'll press Q and go under dice. So if we wanted to basically twist this, we would need to smart apply everything and then join it. So now if you press J, it will join it together, but it'll also perform a smart apply right before it to ensure that the join happens successfully. That means whenever I press T to twist, I can just click and it will just jump into the twist operation. However, we see that the topology given was a little bit hard for our bevel. So let's actually press Ctrl Z, undo it. Let's select it again. And this time, instead of even joining, which is the topic of discussion, we'll just press T, which will just exit the twist. And let's just reduce our loopage just a little bit. And we click to jump in. And I think it's the loop in the center that's actually doing us in. So let's just reduce it slightly. We press T. And now we see that we're able to get a slightly better result. However, we can always tab in edit mode and just look at our geometry to see what is getting in our way. So we could slide this edge over, we could go under bevel and actually adjust the amount of bevel that's happening. But instead of adjusting the amount of bevel, I like to get in and perform topological examinations. For example, this edge was redundant and wasn't needed to be present, so it's causing some issues. This one is too close to this particular edge, so it just needs to be slid over. So sometimes instead of redicing, as you saw me doing, which could possibly lead to a crash, sometimes it's just a little bit of examination as far as why dice doesn't work out. Keep in mind, there are two different algorithms whenever it comes to dice, with mesh intersect being the one that is typically best for multi-mesh type dicing, as you see here. However, whenever we use dice, we actually use the one called knife, which we can see specified in our UI at the very bottom. If we press Q, we can actually change it to intersect, but really it's too late for that. Really the point was to just show that J will smart apply and then join the objects, but you could also join them, smart apply them on the way into twist as well. So however you choose to do it, just letting you know that improvements have been made in that regard. So if you're new to HardOps, dice and twist is one of those ways that we try to ensure new users have a fun time. So I'll press 1, look at things from front. We'll press S, X, and scale things out. And my favorite example with dice is to, or even my favorite tool test with dice is the following, where basically I will draw the following shapes, and then I will just join them and dice them all at the same time. However, the process is that if you're trying to just jump straight into twist, you can just do that without even having to bother with the whole apply process thinking aspect of things. So we really tried to take some of the guesswork out of dice and twist to try to make them both as streamlined as possible. So before jumping over, we will perform one more join, or in this case a make operation of a cylinder. We'll press A in order to bring it out bidirectionally and plug that into the other side, and we can create one more here as well, just bringing that over to the other side. Keep in mind that anytime you want to adjust your diameter in Boxcutter, you can just press D and do that anytime just by going to the dimensions area of the box slider of the new box helper. So after clicking and applying, we now have a shape that's basically worthy. However, we could make it even more worthy. So let's look at it from the side, and we will just dice this area, or we'll cut this area out. However, we'll ever scroll, bring it back, press D, switch over to box, perform a box cut here, and perform a box cut here, press 1, where we're now looking at it on the side. Or actually, I'm holding Alt to snap my view. Sorry about that. So with this shape, we can ever scroll, bring that back too, and let's just shift click on shade solid, which will give us a solid duplicate. So I'm gonna set my snapping to vertex with Control Shift Tab, meaning that when I move it over, it will just perfectly fit to the side. We want everything to fit inside the box because it's all going to be spinning. But now with this all selected, we could just press Q, go under dice, and choose to dice. But if we press T to twist, we already know that it's going to trigger the behavior of join and smart apply prior to us having to do this. And there really isn't very complex of modifiers happening with this. So to really make things more interesting, let's put a bevel on this, which anytime you put bevel, it's going to cause you to reevaluate some of your cuts and geometry. That's just the way bevel is. So let's just bring back this particular wedge, and we just want to bring it out so that way it terminates a little bit earlier with the surface than we had it going before. And we could also put a weighted normal on this just because it'll make it look better. And that's really it. So we want this to be the main object because we want everything to be joined to this one that has the bevel. And so we go back under dice again, we press T, and we click and apply, and we're now inside of dice, inside of the twist operation after completing it. So as we bring it in, we see that things get a little bit skewed in the back, but really we could clean that up if we wanted. In fact, we could use dice to clean that up. And what I mean by that is we'll just click to apply this operation, but with our back, we'll need to isolate it. So we'll use sharp because sharp is the quickest way to just help us quickly isolate this area. And we'll jump into dice and edit mode, visually look for what we want, click and apply, and we see that the back now looks properly. So whenever it comes to topological replacement, I expect its final form to be quite nimble at getting in there and replacing topology on the fly, and that hopefully there will be a time where we will just isolate what we want visible. We will select a flow that we want with the geometry that's currently existing, and we'll just take care of the rest. But with this, it's just a matter of us choosing to put a blank material on it. From here, we could Alt-H, unhide everything in edit mode, and just select the main body, press Control-I to select everything that isn't the main body. And under the Q menu, under materials, we can also add a blank material. So there's no Alt-M option in edit mode because I believe M is associated with other things. But just like that, we're able to quickly assign some materials in edit mode. And when we look at the render result, we see that there's probably a little bit of scrolling to do. So let's just shift click on material scroll, which means we're just getting in and replacing the particular graph, but we're keeping the index. Not needed, but we can also shift scroll to jump to the next material in the stack and begin scrolling it as well. And now I'm jumping to the main material and we're just scrolling it to a material that's a little more acceptable. So we can press Alt-V, press S to jump through our environments till we find one we want. We can press V in order to turn it off in case we want to just look at just the object. But just like that is a little bit about join and smart apply with twist on the fly and just having a little bit of fun with it in bevel. So in closing, I just want to say that in addition to being able to use dice in terms of twisting and topological replacement, dice also works great with curves. So if we just create a quick shape, I'm just going to Shift A, insert a cylinder, RX90, and we'll just scale this down. With our object placed here, I'm going to press Control A to apply the location, meaning that when I press Alt X to mirror, it'll use the origin that's placed in the center. We'll just mirror that to the other side, press QOT, and we'll change this to be a convex hull. From here, we'll delete the original cylinder. And in order to put a loop down the middle of this, we'll just symmetrize it. And let's just grab this loop, and we'll press E. And we'll use a little mesh machine for this. I'll press Y and choose Fuse. For Fuse, you can press R in order to change which axis you're dealing with. We want to change this to bridge. And I've always pressed Z, C, Z, X, C, V until I find the value that I want. For this one, it looks like we're going to be using X today. So just roll the wheel a little bit, and just like that, we were able to create this shape. And Alt X to mirror that to the other side. And I'm going to select this area, press J in order to put an edge directly down the middle. And that shows me that I need to move this out a little bit more if I plan to put a circle here. Sometimes I'll just put an edge into place just so whenever I press Control, there's definitely a dot there because dots play off of edges. For this, I want to bevel it, so we'll just click on bevel. But instead of leaving it this way, we'll get a reverse bevel. And let's increase our width, click to apply, and just shift click on sharpen in the Q menu in order to lower the auto smooth. And from here we can Alt X, X mirror while holding shift on clicking the Y, and then we click on the X to keep the X. And from here we have now created this particular object. So just a fun little test object I enjoy making, just kind of a little mechanical joint of sorts. From here we'll press B to bevel. However, we see that we still have Q bevel on, so we want to turn that off. And after moving this shape around, we can press X to turn this into a slice and jump over to Ngon. We could always just be alt scrolling, but I've just gotten used to changing shapes in the D menu now. And we'll alt X, mirror it on the Z as well, meaning we could select this and also mirror it on the Z. So with this shape, if we wanted to deform it along a curve, all we have to do is just select it, mesh tools, dice, and we could press S to smart apply, which will just apply everything, and then we can add some loops in. So that's it. That's pretty much all it takes in order to perform a dice on any series of objects. Well, objects, not empties or curves or anything like that. So we'll Shift A, add a Bezier curve, but I'll use the F9 to make it face to view, which gives us a curve that's actually facing where we are. And all we do is just reposition our curve, and then we just select both our objects. Actually, they should be joined. We should have pressed J during the dice process, but that's fine. After selecting both of them, we could just choose curve modifier, and then using the F9 panel, we could just scroll through and choose which axis we want. So basically moving this on the X will get us where we want to go. And then we could always just tab into the curve in edit mode and press Ctrl T 90 in order to rotate this 90 degrees on a tilt. And the thing about curves too is that curves resolution impacts the ability to deform. So you see that by going into the Q menu and raising the resolution, I'm able to get a much nicer curve. In fact, it's kind of a trippy effect just lowering the resolution. But I just want to close on the note of just talking about using dice in terms of curves as well, just so you don't think it's all about just dicing and twisting. It's really about dicing and getting the shape to fit whatever form you need. But with that, I'll wrap up this video. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.